Hello everybody, what is up? My name is Zero Solstice, and today I'm going to do something a little different than my usual repertoire of content. I haven't done anything for Guild Wars 2 in a short while, but today's patch notes came out and they actually have some beef to them, and I kind of decided that I would use that and go ahead and analyze the changes as quickly as I can. I can be a bit talkative, but I'm going to do what I can to go over the changes to the Necromancer class and try to evaluate, like, objectively viewing the changes, how does it really affect us? And are they really as big nerfs as people are probably going to pitchfork for? So on and so forth. So, the first note is their little block statement, Necromancer. So, our biggest focus in this iteration for Necromancers was that of Epidemic, in that its impact is too instant in most PvP scenarios, as well as its heavy toll on our servers. Secondarily, we've long felt that the Plague Elite was lackluster and was in need of a rework. In addition to a variety of weapon-based quality of life changes, we're excited to see how the skill changes fare over time. So, their major focus here was modifying Plague to do something different because they felt that just turning you into a big floating blob of tankiness was pretty lackluster and not very gameplay intensive. You pressed a button and then waited 20 seconds. And Epidemic has been a long-standing problem in World v. World at this point. And not only has it just been overbearing for a lot of guild groups, like large-scale fighting in World v. World is just filled to the brim with Epidemic Necros. It has been for a long time. But an effect such as Epidemic has a pretty big impact on server performance. If you've ever played World v. World in a higher tier server, on, let's say, Eternal Battlegrounds, and you've been in a big blob fight, you've probably felt the impact on the servers where, you try to use your skills, and nothing happens. So you spam your skills, and nothing happens. And 20 seconds later, eventually, something happens. But that's ANET server in a nutshell, and Epidemic absolutely has a hand in that. A whole lot of things have a hand in that, but it's mostly the fact that it occurs at all. So I understand their focuses. So Epidemic and Plague being the big ones, and then just other changes here and there to try to even out game flow, survivability versus damage output, things of that nature. And a general thesis or a general motif of a lot of the changes in this patch are tending to make the game a little bit slower and give the game more counterplay. And I can appreciate that. So with that, let's start moving into each of the individual changes. So the first major change is Plague Sending. The cooldown of this trait has been increased from 30 seconds to 40 seconds in PvP only. So the reason for this is because Plague Sending, well, sure, it is like a passive stun break, but that doesn't really matter. It's mostly the fact that being on a low cooldown, plus it has synergy with the Spike Grandmaster trait, it makes it so that other classes trying to play condition-based builds against a Necromancer don't have a giant window where they feel safe to put a massive bomb onto the Necro to be able to burst them down. So by increasing this gap from 30 seconds to 40 seconds, it gives more space to be able to, for example, like, all right, let's say I'm playing Condi Engineer. Okay, I can put a few pistol rounds, maybe a Sigil of Torment, and poison darts into the Necro to try to bait out the passive Plague Sending. And then after I know that's on cooldown, all right, now I have this nice big window where I can go for the Immobilize, like the Glue Shot or the Glue Bomb, and then go for the Static Shot and the Blowtorch and just try to wait it off and bait out the heal and stuff like that. So I like this change. I think it's fine. Plague Sending's really strong, so I can certainly see in the name of counterplay why they would want to increase the window just marginally. It's just a 33% increase, but again, it has synergy with the Spike Grandmaster, so you can reasonably easily reduce that to a much more active number. So I think the change is fine. The second change is Chilling Nova. The damage of this trait has been reduced by 33% in PvP only. So this change is to alleviate some of that quote-unquote free burst that Power Reapers are able to get on a regular basis. So Chill comes from a decent number of sources on the class. Like, you can just throw staff 5 down, you can pop Infusing Terror's secondary ability. You can put a chill field from Executioner Scythe down on someone. There are plenty of ways to get chill onto someone. Greatsword abilities, Greatsword 5. To where Chilling Nova had reasonable uptime. Like, you could almost guarantee that it would go off cooldown at every real possibility, every real scenario. So reducing the damage from Chilling Nova just makes it so that more of the damage is over time rather than entirely up front. And it makes sense because it could lead to those scenarios where someone's at, let's say, 60% HP. They have their heal off cooldown, like they could heal if they want to. And they just sit there like, no, I should be fine. And all of a sudden you knock them to 50%. And then passive Spinal Shivers procs for another 15% of their HP. Then Chilling Nova procs for like 20% of their HP. And it's just, all of a sudden they went from 60% to 15 or 10%. And it's like, now they don't have time to use their heal because you're just killing them. So it deals a little bit with that spike damage, especially considering the lack of really good defensive amulet options and such in PvP. So this change is fine. It is a nerf, but I see the direction they're coming from. 33% might be a touch steep. Maybe 25 or 20 would have been fine, but I'm not complaining. I think it's fine, and we'll just have to see how it plays. The third change is Rise. The cooldown of this skill has been increased from 40 seconds to 60 seconds in PvP only. So this is a 50% increase to the base cooldown of Rise. And the reason for this is because Rise just gives you direct percentage-based damage mitigation. So they wanted to try to cut down on a Necromancer's ability to just cut down large amounts of damage, because the way that the math works is if you cut down percentage-based damage rather than flat damage, then that means that the squishier you are, like let's say you're running less toughness or less vitality, the larger the number of that damage that actually gets reduced. So Rise actually, on like a sheer toughness ratio level, Rise actually benefits low toughness builds more than it does high toughness builds. So Rise is really good on, say, your Marauders, Power Reapers, because it helps drop that 9k backstab down to a 6k backstab, whereas if you were running a bunch of toughness, it would only drop that 6k backstab down to a 4k backstab. It's a less steep difference. It's still very real. Like, the skill is good all the time, absolutely, but it has a mathematically larger impact on lower toughness builds. So I think this change is okay. It really hurts and it really sucks that Rise is getting nerfed again, but I know the reason why. I see where they're coming from, and because it's only a change to the cooldown, this change on like a deeper level is actually mostly fine, because it still plays well with Augury of Death. So if you're running the Shout trait and you hit a bunch of dudes, the cooldown gets proportionally percentage-wise reduced. So let's say you hit 3 to 5 targets. The cooldown of this thing only increased by like an actual 7 to 10 seconds. I'm not going to fully do the math, but the actual difference if you're running Augury of Death is not that large. And I think between those things, I think this change is perfectly reasonable and perfectly doable. So the next change is to Tainted Shackles. This skill now will apply 5 seconds of revealed to enemies the first time it successfully hits. So I'll be honest, I actually really like this change, not only because it's something new and something like reasonably intuitive, but also because it's showing that Aina isn't afraid to give functionality or revise things on the base classes. It's not all about the elite specs. Like, I think this is a cool change because it says that they're still looking, if you know what I mean. Aina is still going into this with the mindset of like, the core class still actually has uses and still actually has play, so we might as well update it properly. Now, if you read deeper, you can see that this is one change on one skill, and it's not even a change that has any major real impact. It's something minor and marginal. But in total, I like the fact that they did this. This is pretty cool. So there's not a whole lot to say here besides that. The next change is Infusing Terror, which is Reaper Shroud number 3. This skill no longer pulses stability, but instead it grants 3 stacks for 6 seconds upon activating it. The active form of this skill now reduces incoming physical and condition damage by 20% for its duration. So this is pretty sweet. The skill no longer pulsing stability. For one, it feels pretty bad. Granting 3 stacks for 6 seconds means it now grants half the stability that it used to, and that feels really shitty. And the fact that it's all up front means that, and obviously, like, take this with a grain of salt. The fact that it's all up front means that it's much easier to convert and counterplay, but not only is that the purpose of this change, they're doing that to almost every class where it's valid to do so, and that's fine. But this also increases counterplay in the Necro versus Necro mirror, which, to be honest, if you ask me, is the single most cancerous RNG-ridden mirror matchup in the entire game, because of things like Infusing Terror. If you went ahead as a Connie Necro, and you, let's say, corrupt booned a Reaper Shrouded Necro that had Infusing Terror going, and converted all of their boons, not only would you fear them, but now they're still pulsing stab, so you can literally Scepter auto them infinitely and just fear, just chain fear them into the floorboards, and it was just disgusting. It was like, was it really wacky to watch? Yes, but was it fun and intuitive? Absolutely not. It was just really kind of unfun gameplay. So I definitely think that in total this is a healthier change. But the real interesting thing is the active form of this skill now reduces incoming physical and condition damage by 20% for its duration. That is awesome. Okay, so you can argue that this is active passive mitigation. So Necromancer doesn't have any active mitigation in the form of blocks, invulns, or anything similar to that, but Necro does have decent, I would say, access to things such as protection or retaliation, but we'll get back to the retail soon. Some decent stability uptime now, and some percentage mitigation modifiers like Rise. So if you tack this on top of it, between the uptime of this 20% and the fact that it's instant when you want to call on it, you can go into Shroud whenever you want, there's no cooldown, and you can activate this ability whenever you want. It doesn't have a cast time. This makes for some interesting gameplay, and I do like how this can affect the class. I do like what this does. It kind of shows that ArenaNet is willing at this point in time to give Necromancer some more tools for survivability that aren't strictly active forms of mitigation, such as blocks, invulns, stealth, other such utilities. And I dig this in total. I think this is healthy for the class, but there are some other minor things that kind of suck. So like the fact that it gives you all 3 stacks up front, and it only gives you 3 stacks, means that this is actually a nerf to Blighter's Boon as well. This is a marginal nerf to Power Necro, Blighter's Boon, Sustain, because half the stacks of stability total means half the healing it used to give you. It used to give you roughly 1.2k healing, now it's only going to give you 600, and that's a real number. Stuff like that adds up over time. But in total, I like this change. 20% physical and condition damage reduction will generally amount to more, I would say, than 600 healing. And on top of that, the percentage mitigation is better more of the time than Blighter's Boon synergy. So I like this change quite a lot. The next change is to Chilling Victory. The cooldown of this trait has been increased from 1 second to 2 seconds in PvP only. Now, this is really a straightforward change, if you ask me. They basically just want to make it so that we don't ramp up quite as fast, and we don't ramp up quite as high all on our own, so that we don't just become really powerful really quickly, and we don't become as powerful. And it's also a nerf to Blighter's Boon Sustain. So all in all, I can see why they're doing this. This is still in the pursuit of trying to mitigate some of that high damage / high burst gameplay that comes out currently. And it's also an attempt to mitigate some of the sustain that some classes are able to get. So this change, it feels pretty bad, but I understand where they're coming from, and I think it's fine. And now we get to the interesting one. So Plague Elite. This skill has been reworked and has been renamed to Plague Lands. Plague Lands. This skill creates a 240 radius corrupted area at the Necromancer's initial location for 10 seconds. After 1 second, it pulses damage and conditions in that area for 9 seconds. Each pulse applies a new condition, and each pulse applies all conditions from every pulse before it. Conditions applied in order are bleeding, poison, torment, vulnerability, cripple, weakness, blind, chill, and burning. Recharge is set to 120 seconds. So, the way this changed is Plague is no longer a thing. It used to have a 3-minute cooldown. It is now Plague Lands, which has a 2-minute cooldown. You no longer get any sort of major toughness or vitality spike, so you no longer have that stun break into a hyper tank, like just survive for 20 seconds play style skill. It no longer exists, it's just gone. We now have a small, basically like layway stack-worthy style skill where you drop a well somewhere. You can honestly think of Plague Lands as a brand new elite well. That's effectively what this is now. And you pretty much drop it down, and every time it ticks, sorry, I hit my desk, and every time it hits, or it ticks, it applies an additional condition to any foes that are still within it. So I see this skill, unfortunately, only really being a PvE stack sort of business, where you would use it in something like, say, raids, where you can corral AI, bosses, things of that nature. Enemies aren't really moving. Because given its radius, only being 240, it's not quite large enough to be... It's not quite large enough to be consistent, especially given how slow it functions. It functions over 10 seconds, but only once every second, and... I'm not sure how to feel about this yet. I'm really going to have to play around with it at some point, but the way I read it currently, it's very much just like a elite well for PvE that helps DPS for condition-based builds, and that's about it. But the conditions applied in order does actually quite matter. It starts with bleed, poison, and torment, so it applies those the most. Then it moves into vulnerability. So you have a bunch of your basic damage applications and then damage increase. And then before some of the more useful things to us, it applies cripple, weakness, and blind. So this is interesting. The fact that it applies cripple, weakness, and blind before and more than chill and burning, it kind of feels... It kind of feels pretty bad. So, I mean, I guess it depends on how hard that burning ticks, for example. But because this order matters, that means this burning's applied once, whereas something like, say, the bleed is applied 9 times. And so burning being applied last, it makes you wonder, like, did they internally test, like, how many pulses of each of these conditions was actually going to be overbearing or what? Because the payoff has to be, for this skill to be, like, really usable in a lot of different places, the payoff has to be equitable throughout the skill, so that if you put it somewhere and an opponent steps in it at any time during its interval for some amount of duration, there's some reasonable payoff to be had. So if you put it down and it ticks on someone and then they instantly walk out of it, all you probably did was 2 stacks of bleeding and 1 stack of poison. And that, for a 2-minute cooldown, that payoff is garbage. You can then think of it, if someone steps into it 5 seconds later, then they get bleeding, poison, torment, vulnerability, cripple, and weakness. Like, okay, they get 1 application of all those things. That's not bad. That's fine. Sure. And then stepping into it at that last tick, they get 1 of all 9 of those. Like, okay, I can kind of see where this is coming from. So, because of the way it ticks, it feels very backloaded. But backloaded skills generally do not make for very good consistent gameplay, because they're easy to counterplay, they're easy to not get sucked into. I'm really going to have to see the skill in action, but so far I don't see great application for it outside of PvE, but we're just going to have to wait and see. So the next big change is Epidemic. This ability now fires slow arcing projectiles from its initial target to up to 5 targets in range. Foes hit by the projectiles gain all conditions from the original Epidemic target. Projectile strikes are unblockable, but cannot critically hit. Increased radius to 900. I really like this. This is perfect middle ground for what the skill currently does versus what it should continue to do. So the changes here. It now shoots projectiles from people. Think of it, I would assume, probably much like Dagger 4. Dagger offhand number 4. These projectiles, just like the actual ability currently, are still unblockable. But because they're slow moving, they have increased range. And because they are now projectiles, they do damage. So they can't critically hit, so that power builds can't just abuse it for some simple free DPS at range. And to make up for the fact that it's slow moving and now has more counterplay, Epidemic not just 5 condies from the original, it now copies everything from the original target to the 5 targets that it hits. This is really, really nice. I honestly love this. This keeps the skill doing exactly what it always does. It keeps it working in every game mode. It keeps it still in use. And it added in the counterplay that people needed for it to not actually just be the end-all be-all that it currently can be. So this is sweet. There's not a ton left to say. They gave us something and they took something, and it balances out perfectly. If you ask me, I like this quite a lot. The next change is Rending Claws. Applies twice as much vulnerability while your target is below 50% health. This is really sweet because this is decent for PvE, but it's great for this is decent for PvP, but it's great for PvE. So it makes Power Necro with an axe just like a one-man 25 vulnerability machine. And even if that's not something that's super necessary, like there's plenty of vuln application in PvE, it's really nice that a single class, especially one that doesn't entirely always have a place in the game, it's really nice that necromancers have one job where someone can easily say, oh, we need someone to boost our DPS, slot in a Power Necro, have him auto-attack shit, easy. So I like this. This is pretty cool. Ghastly Claws. This skill now deals 1% more damage per stack of vulnerability on the target. So people have been asking for a change like this for quite a while. A lot of people thought that axe autos didn't have a large enough payoff, and that the vulnerability that they did should either be increased or should lend itself further to the weapon, like more so than just the trait increasing the damage and such. And this really hits that. So now not only can you vuln stack really hard in PvE and vuln stack pretty effectively in PvP, but now that all that vuln stacking has like a crazy DPS payoff. So now I like this because it is kind of bursty, but it's all in a single skill. So there's counterplay in the fact that if someone's trying to fight you, they can assess the fact that you're running an axe and that you're going to do a lot of your damage and gain a lot of your life force generation from your axe too. And they can counterplay that appropriately by dodging, blocking, so on and so forth. And I like that. It lends itself to, all right, Necromancer has things that matter. We took away like a little bit of the spike damage and whatnot from some of the extraneous sources like Chilling Nova, and we stuck it more into that Axe 2. And now if you can properly mitigate the X2, then you're in a good spot in this fight. And I like that. That's counterplay. That is knowing your matchups. And I think that's fine. Unholy Feast. This skill no longer applies retaliation. It now invokes a secondary AoE strike against foes below 25% health. Fixed skill fact bugs that showed range instead of radius and did not display the correct number of boons converted. So the bug fix, if you were to mouse over Unholy Feast, next to the boons converted section, it would say no number at all rather than saying 2. It used to say 1 and then they bumped it up. And so they fixed that, so now it properly says 2. Cool. Along with this, I'll also get to the next change. Spiteful Spirit updated this trait to clarify that it no longer is casting Unholy Feast. So Spiteful Spirit for a long time was thought and known to be Unholy Feast. It would cast Axe 3 whenever you entered Shroud. But when the change was made to increase the number of stacks or the number of boons converted on Unholy Feast from 1 to 2. Spiteful Spirit stayed at 1. So now they're directly clarifying that Spiteful Spirit is its own skill. It's not actually Unholy Feast. So cool. Unholy Feast no longer applying Retail is kind of a nerf, to be honest. Retail gave us, as a full power spec, it gave you a lot of free damage when people tried to fight you. And the fact that each target hit was its own additional application of Retail, this actually nerfs Blighter's Boon pretty heavily. Like, one single Unholy Feast alone could give you a whole lot of free life force just from the Retail procs. So all of this adding together, there's a lot of changes to Blighter's Boon coming in this patch. So Blighter's Boon isn't going to be the end all be all, but I still think it's probably your best bet for a power spec that isn't just auto attacking in PvE. So this is interesting. But they replace that Retail with more upfront damage that acts as an execution. So it invokes a secondary AoE strike against foes below 25% HP. I don't really like this because this is too conditional. Having an opponent below 25% HP all the time is just not something that really happens. This is good for like your team fight scenario, but this is generally, I think, pretty poor for your 1v1s, your 2v2s, your small scale skirmishes. And Retail uptime is just simply way more reliable and way less conditional than a 25% executioner strike. And there isn't even any specific statement of how much damage this is supposed to do. So I'm going to have to see in game exactly what this secondary AoE strike is. But my assumption is that it's probably basically an Unholy Feast that occurs, at least the damage of Unholy Feast. It's a second Unholy Feast that occurs from the location of the 25% HP foe. So that's like an additional 2-3k damage spike that's AoE. So it basically turns low health enemies into conduits for extra damage. And that's kind of cool. But in total, the way this affects Blighter's Boon, the way this affects our reliable DPS from Retail, I'm really not sure that I like this change. I'm going to have to see it in action, but I'm not a fan currently. And the final changes are to Dagger main hand skills, Life Siphoned and Dark Pact. So I'll start with the Dark Pact because it has inverse synergy with Life Siphon. Dark Pact, increased damage by 20%, now inflicts 2 stacks of bleeding on you for 10 seconds. So Dagger main hand is a power weapon, just it simply is. There's no real synergy with Condi whatsoever, and if you're running some sort of hybrid spec, it's way more, like infinitely more beneficial to run Scepter instead. So the bleeds basically do no damage. It puts conditions on you. Okay, sure. The damage increase doesn't matter a ton, but this thing can do a lot of damage. So the fact that they increase the damage means the flat number has gone up quite a bit, but the skill isn't really there for its damage. It's mostly there for allowing you to combo out, say, Dagger autos, Executioner's Scythe, Well Bomb, something similar. You use it more for the CC than for the damage. So the damage change, honestly, doesn't matter a whole ton, but I guess it's pretty cool that they're kind of giving it like that skill shot style. Like, you see the big wind up, and then there's the payoff. Like, bam, you do 4.5k to a dude and immobilize them. Like, ow, that hurts. So that's okay, sure, why not? Life Siphon, though, gains 20% increased healing if cast while you are bleeding. Deals 20% more damage to bleeding foes. This is, this is interesting. In small-scale skirmishes, as a Power Necro, bleeds are common, so the increased damage from this skill is reasonably common. Like, I'll say that it can come up often enough for that 20% to be, probably think of it like a 5 to an 8% all the time damage increase rather than a 20% some of the time. But what's interesting is the synergy that they added, where now that Dark Pact gives you bleed, you gain 20% increased healing if you cast this while bleeding. So Dark Pact bleeds lasts for 10 seconds, which is more than enough time to, at some point, either immediately after or down the road, cast Life Siphon. And 20% increased healing, that's quite a bit. Life Siphon already heals you for, I want to say, in the ballpark of 3.4k if every single piece of its multi-chain hit lands. So an additional 20% on top of that, you're going to be looking at like an additional 400 healing coming out of that. That's not bad. That's not terrible. Does that outscale the bleed? Maybe, maybe not. So we'll have to see. But I like the fact that it kind of it kind of gives that sense of inflicting harm on yourself to inflict big harm on your opponents, but then also inside of your own kit being able to mitigate that harm you did to yourself. Like, this is a weird change. It's interesting. I don't think it's necessarily good, or even if it was necessary to begin with on just a core level, but it's nifty. It's got some interesting niche purposes somewhere, I'm sure. But in total, these changes are mostly just like eyebrow raisers. Like, okay, all right, you got me. But I spent the last 32 minutes talking about these patches. I was hoping to spend way less time than that, but like I said, I'm the talkative type. I hope if anyone actually sat through watching all this, that my insights are usable to you in some way. If you agree, disagree with any of the assessments that I had, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I'm always one for a good discussion. But until the next patch, until the next video, until the next time, my name is Zir Solstice, and as always, have a wonderful day.